Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so I think we will get started. My name is Ian Baldwin. I am the co-chair of the Access Committee of the Boston Society for Architecture. My other co-chair is Josh Safdie, who apparently is being kept away by the incoming storm. But today's presentation was organized by the New England ADA Center and the Institute for Human-Centered Design by Kathy Gips. So shortly, I'm going to turn it over to her for the main part of the presentation, but just some preliminaries first. The slide that's up right now, if you can see that, it has some instructions for how to turn on captions. I should also say that the meeting is, in addition to being recorded, we're also transcripting the meeting. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see those three buttons that say more, and there'll be an option to show the transcript. A reminder, if you want to keep the transcript, that you have to manually save the transcript. So at the end of the presentation, but before the Zoom ends, go into the transcript and click that Save Transcript button at the bottom. We are going to be taking questions throughout the presentation. Just type those into the chat. And at the end, during the question period, if we need more clarification, one of the moderators will call on you. But just put those in the chat, and I believe last time we got to pretty much all the questions. And also, of course, please make sure your audio is muted. If you are going to turn your video on, that's fine, but you might want to not be moving around your house, making breakfast and things like that. Okay, so I think we can go to the next slide. So this is for those of you who will be getting continuing education credits through the AIA. There will be a form that we will put a link to in the chat. So all you have to do is click on that form, fill out your name and your AIA number, and you will be automatically submitted for credits. This is 1.5 HSW credits. And I'm just going to quickly read off the learning objectives for this part of the webinar. Objective 1, design after successfully completing the program, participants will be able to design multifamily housing common use areas to comply with federal and state accessibility requirements, to design differences between Group 1 FHA kitchens and bathrooms and Group 2, 2A ADA UFAS accessible kitchens and bathrooms, to understand functional reasons for accessibility requirements in relation to people with certain disabilities, and to provide compliant building plans for builders and developers. So again, if you are wanting AIA credit for this webinar, be sure to look for that link that will be posted in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to moderate the rest of the discussion.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of Untangling Housing and Accessibility Requirements in Massachusetts. Part 1 was on scoping, part 2 is on design. We've got some participants who are here this week who are not here last week, so I'm going to go over some very basic stuff just to introduce myself. I'm the Director of Training at the New England ADA Center, which is a project of the Institute for Human-Centered Design. We also have with us Deborah Ryan. Deb, some of you know her as, she's an accessibility specialist. She has her own company, and she's the former executive director of the Mass Architectural Access Board. Rex J. Pace is with us. He's the senior advisor for accessible design at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So he is an expert on all things fair housing and Section 504 HUD. And Davian Shulis, who is the director of the Office of Technical and Information Services at the U.S. Access Board, and he is the absolute expert on everything having to do with the ADA standards. So let me just, a little bit about the ADA centers. When Congress passed the ADA, they decided it was sufficiently confusing that they needed to provide some help. We all have the same toll-free number, so please feel free to call us We deal with everything, not just architectural access, but education, employment, transportation. So if it has anything to do with the ADA, we are glad to answer your questions. And the ADA Center is a project of this wonderful nonprofit organization, which I know some of you are familiar with, the Institute for Human-Centered Design. We have beautiful offices in Boston, which unfortunately have been closed for quite a while, but we are doing a lot of things online through Zoom. And so please go to our website, sign up to receive information about our events, and just check out the calendar. We're doing lunch and learns, which are now basically learns. And they are usually about once a month, and they're often on Wednesdays at noon. So overview, again, this is going to be a bit of a repeat for those of you who were here last week. But I do want to, sort of point out why things are so confusing in Massachusetts in terms of accessibility in multifamily housing. And the reason is because not only do we have 3 federal laws, which makes things sort of confusing enough, but we have Massachusetts law, which is unique. So we are the only state in the country that has our own unique accessibility requirements. And I think all of you are probably familiar with those rules and regulations of the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board, 521 CMR. Most of the states have either adopted the International Building Code, Chapter 11, and that's the chapter that is on accessibility, or they've adopted the ADA standards for accessible design. So there's a lot of harmonization, but we have to be particularly careful in Massachusetts because of our own unique requirements. Very important to understand and sort of get in your brain that there are 2 kinds of mobility accessible dwelling units. The first kind is the MAB Group 1, which some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. It applies with new construction, 4 or more units. And then, I'm sorry, 3 or more units. And then the Fair Housing Act. And these units apply to, these design standards apply to many units in a building, but they're less accessible. So the idea is really aging in place. People will be able to stay in their units. It's not for somebody who uses a wheelchair, someone with quadriplegia or paraplegia. It's just not large enough, but it's going to work for somebody with canes or crutches, or somebody who uses a wheelchair but can stand. So they're less accessible, and they apply to many units in a building. The Group 2 and the ADA and the Section 504 mobility units only applies to a percentage. So it's 5% of the units, and they are more accessible. So these are the units that really work for somebody who uses a wheelchair and can't stand. And we're going to go into the details of this later in the presentation, but just again, to give you sort of a quick view, on the left, the smaller units that are Group 1 and FHA, and on the right, the larger units, which are Group 2, ADA 504, UFAS, and the kitchen, the same thing, turning radius required, all sorts of things required in that 5%. So Deb, want to talk a little bit about the rules and regulations of the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. So I'm actually going to start off with the regulations and the variance process right up front. So the existing regulations that are in effect today have an effective date of January 27, 2006, and they have not been changed since then. They really haven't been changed since 1996. There have been small amendments since then, but 2006 is the most recent version. So the AAB regs are a building code incorporated by reference into the Mass State Building Code, and the Architectural Access Board can grant variances from those regulations. Next slide, Kim. So only the AAB itself has the authority to grant a variance, and variances are based on impracticability. And this is something that you need to prove. You need to prove to the board that you cannot comply with the regulation because the cost is excessive without any substantial benefit to persons with disabilities. So it's not cost alone, it's excessive cost without benefit. Or the other trigger is it's technologically infeasible. That does not happen too often, but there are instances where it in fact may be technologically infeasible. Next slide. The AAB actually just recently revised its application for variance. You can get it on the web. You can submit your application through email, which is great. In the service notice that people may be familiar with does not have to be notarized anymore, which is also a good thing. So you can apply for a variance for a specific technical provision of the regulation. We did not talk about variances during scoping because that's not where you apply for a variance. You actually apply for a variance for a specific section of the regs, like the ramp width, a handrail height, clearance in a toilet room. And again, you need to prove that the cost to comply is excessive without any substantial benefit. You can also request a timed variance or a temporary variance. So if it's phased construction and you can't make the building accessible right away, or there's some funding problems, you can actually request a variance from the board and state the reasons why you cannot achieve compliance right away. If it's a city or town issue, they may want to see some proof of that you will get the funding, but you can do that as well, and the board can grant time relief. Next slide. So the variance, again, as I stated earlier, you can download the new variance application right on the web. You fill out the application and provide supporting documentation. I recommend that you make the application as clear as possible on the issue you are requesting. Plans, color-coded plans, photos of the issue you are requesting, extremely helpful. So if you have a photo, if you're requesting a variance for the width of a ramp and it's existing, send a photo of the ramp, maybe send a tape measure on the ramp, show what the confining issues are, to make it easy for the board to understand what it is. You're the one that's familiar with your building. The board generally is not, unless they happen to live in your community. So it's really helpful to give them as much information as possible. Next slide. As part of the application, you have to fill out what I mentioned before was this, it's the service notice. You have to send a copy of your application to the local building official, the Independent Living Center, and the local Disability Commission. The board does that, so those are the folks that are living in the city or town where your project is. And if they have any additional information or want to offer support or opposition, they will be able to do that. And there'll be a 2-week wait period for the board to receive any comments from them. Recently, again, the service notice you used to have to notarize it. That has been done away with, which is great. The board meets every other Monday, and the application will be held for a minimum of 2 weeks prior to the meeting. So depending on how long, when you get it into the board will depend on how long it will take for them to review it. So I recommend you go to the board's website, look at their meeting schedule. You can time it so that it would only take 2 weeks for it to be heard. If you miss the deadline by a day, then you're looking at 4 weeks. But definitely view their website for their schedule. Next slide. The board also will issue advisory opinions, and anyone can request an opinion from the board. Advisory opinions are not meant to ask the board, if we request a variance, will you grant it? It's not a substitution for a variance. It is a clarification of a specific regulation. So if you're curious about, does the regulation require handrails on a slope of 1 in 19, then you can get that opinion from the board. It's not a substitution for a variance. Next slide. Okay, that's
Great. So Rex, you're on. You want to show yourself and unmute yourself?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. Can you hear me all right, Kathy?
Can hear you good.
Great. So I'm going to be covering the fair housing part of the day's presentation. And just to recap from last time, fair housing is actually a very broad law, covers many protected classes of individuals. Of course, we're focusing on people with disabilities today. And the law focuses on a number of issues in regard to disabilities, the policy and procedures of a rental housing and or for sale condominium type situation, deals with, again, deals with policy modifications that a resident might make to a unit. But today we're going to focus on the design and construction requirements of the Act. So there's 7 of those, and we'll go through those now. The first one is a requirement for basically the covered dwelling units to be on an accessible route, have an accessible interest on an accessible route connected to the other common use areas. The common use areas and public areas themselves need to be accessible. And then there's a requirement for usable doors, which will be mostly like you think it should be, except in the interior of the units, it's a little different than it would be normally. It's basically passage doors. Requirement 4, that deals with the accessible route into and through the covered dwelling unit itself, which can be a little different than the public and common use spaces. Number 5, again, this is in the covered unit, dwelling unit itself. It's the requirement for accessible environmental controls, basically. And number 6 is the provision that requires reinforcing in bathrooms for later installation of grab bars. And number 7 is regards usable kitchens and bathrooms. It's really about clear for and maneuvering space in these areas. So there's 7 requirements, although they do vary a lot in their scope. So some of them are very broad, some of them are very focused. In addition, one thing to keep in mind is that there's really not a standard for fair housing like there is for the Massachusetts. It's not like a building code like you have for Massachusetts, or standards you have for the ADA or the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504. It's really was intended to have guidelines to give builders and so forth flexibility. So I'm talking today mostly about the fair housing accessibility guidelines. They themselves are one of the 15 safe harbors. They're kind of serve as the foundation for the other safe harbors, but they are in fact a safe harbor too. So over time, we've gotten up to 15 of them. Some of these, some of these are were related to earlier codes that were commonly used or standards that were commonly used, and then eventually they started to track what the International Building Code was doing in their requirements. And this is basically an effort to be consistent with the IBC, so that when a state adopts that code, then you can follow the state code and have a pretty good assurance that you're meeting the obligations of fair housing. Just make sure that the state that you're working with adopted one of the safe harbors on this list. And a very helpful resource is the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. It's got illustrations. It's what a lot of people refer to, and it's probably, other than the guidelines themselves, probably the most commonly used safe harbor there is. So with that, we'll move on to the next topic. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the Rehabilitation Acts, Section 504, as I discussed last time. These are the regulations specific to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And for our and this is when you're a recipient of federal funding, and when you do that, you have to kind of do requirements that are very much like you would find in the ADA for the 5% and 2%, which we talked about last time. These are the higher level, these are the mobility accessible units we're talking here, and the units that are accessible for people with communications disabilities, issues with hearing and vision disabilities primarily. So you have a choice. You can use the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standard, or you can use the 2010 ADA standards, which we did so because a lot of state and local governments that work with housing, and they have housing programs, they will have obligations under the ADA. So we want to make it as consistent as possible for our recipients. So we permitted the 2010 ADA to be a standard you could use to meet the Rehabilitation Act. However, in itself, the 2010 standards is not really equivalent to what's required. There are more stringent requirements both in the UFAST and under Section 504. So we issued a notice in the Federal Register establishing, the 11 instances that you will have to do something that's not in the 2010 standard, or you're permitted, or you're not permitted to do something in the 2010 standard. So if you do these 11 items, then we'll consider the ADA standards otherwise equivalent. And some examples would be, for instance, you would have employee areas would have to be accessible. It could be a very broad issue like that, or it could be something narrower, like the fact you would have your washers and dryers would have to be front loading. And we'll discuss a few of these other issues as we go along today. We'll just highlight them, let you know that they're out there. But this is the chart here from the notice, and it kind of sums it up. It's the best summary I've got. So with that, Kathy, we'll move on.
Okay, so just to mention, it's not just HUD that provides funding for housing, although it is the main provider, but we also do have money from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development Programs, and they use UFAS as the design standard. So unlike HUD, which has a section on housing in their 504 regulations, Rural Development Department of Agriculture does not have a section specifically on multifamily housing, and they just refer us to UFAS. So that's where we look to for all of the design standards if you're receiving federal funding from rural development. Dave?
Thanks, Kathy. So I just wanted to take a moment to update everyone on the standards we have issued under the ADA that date to 2010. As Rex mentioned, that there are some differences from the UFAS standard, which are really called out for purposes of anyone wanting to use the ADA standards, but still meet some of the UFAS requirements that are more stringent. That's what would be necessary for under 504 because so much housing covered by the ADA is also subject to 504 with respect to state and local governments. It bears repeating, and this is something we covered pretty in much detail in the session one, but the ADA and its coverage of housing is basically focused on housing in the state and local government sector, public housing. So any kind of housing provided, built by or on behalf of a state or local government is covered by the ADA and the ADA standards. Now, when we're looking at housing in the private sector, the ADA's coverage is more limited because the ADA in the private sector is covering places of public accommodation and commercial facilities, but not residential facilities privately owned and operated like condominiums or apartments. In order for housing to be covered by the ADA in the private sector, it basically has to meet the definition and function as a place of public accommodation. So if it has certain social services as part of the program of housing, like say halfway houses or homeless shelters, that's a type of housing that is covered. The ADA also covers housing that's integral to a place of public accommodation, like dormitory and student housing at a private university or college. The ADA is also going to cover portions of a residential facility that would function as a place of public accommodation, like a sales or rental office, but not the residential units themselves. And a little later in today's program, we'll highlight some of the provisions for housing and residential units that are unique to the 2010 standards and more stringent than UFAS requirements.
Okay, so we're going to get into site issues. Dave, Debbie, and Rex, I think it might be helpful if you just show yourself and unmute because there's going to be a little back and forth here discussion. So starting with the requirement, or not the requirement, but the allowance. And Rex, you want to pop in here because this is a fair housing issue.
Yeah, so for the units covered under fair housing, these are the ground floor units that are single story. The single story ground floor units are required to meet the act. That's all of them. However, there is an allowance for difficult terrains where you can apply two different what are called site and practicality tests, which can reduce the number of units that you have to make accessible. that otherwise would have to comply. Although we're not going to dwell a lot on it today, because this doesn't happen. It happens very rarely. It's rarely that sites are actually impractical. And this has in large extent to do with the fact that most housing development sites are so manipulated. There's so much construction work on the site, you wind up really kind of negating the issue because you wind up contouring so much of the site for most projects. However, you do have the option. You have the what's called the individual building site test, which you evaluate each individual building or certain common use entrances to buildings, and then you have one that's a broader site analysis test. But even if you had if you were building on the side of a cliff, you would still have to make at least 20% of your ground floor units comply. Usually it'll be more than that because the percentage is related to how much of the site's too steep. And then another thing to remember is that this does not apply to elevator buildings. So we're only talking about buildings that are walk-ups.
In Massachusetts, there is no exemption. You would need a variance, and again, you'd need to prove that it was either technologically infeasible or excessive cost without substantial benefit.
Great. Dave? You need to unmute.
Under the ADA, there is an exception based on structural impracticability, which is a very high test, because this is basically a basis for departure permitted in new construction. And it's really intended to cover those very unique and rare circumstances where compliance is not possible, even in new construction. It is not intended just based on, say, steep terrain. It's got to be really, involving more unique and impactful constraints in order for it to be used. Now, we do want to point out that this exception previously used to be located in the substance of the standards, but is now located in the implementing regulations that are issued by the Department of Justice. So for tracking down this exception, you could find it in the Department of Justice's Title II regulation for state or local governments at the section cited here, 35151A2. And with respect to Title III facilities, with respect to any kind of housing that is covered by the ADA in the private sector, again, functioning as a place of public accommodation, the exception for structural impracticability is found in the Title III regulation for commercial facilities and public accommodations at section 36.401C.
And yeah, and this is an example of where if you're receiving money from HUD, you really need to look at and you're using the 2010, you really need to look at HUD's notice on what it says, because it does not permit you to use this exception for structural impracticality. And part of this is because our regulations actually tell you to go out and select sites that can be accessible. So you really shouldn't have an excuse of an inaccessible site. Now, I suppose it's theoretically possible that you may still get caught in a situation where you have a bad site, but you wouldn't use structural impracticality to say, well, my site's just not, it's not workable. You really are held to selecting a site that is workable. And this again, is under section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Sorry, Deb.
That's okay. Sorry. Again, under the AAB, you would need a variance. There are no exceptions. And
I would just like to point out, Kathy, too, on this topic, that for ADA purposes, there really isn't an analogous variance clearance process. So if one uses an exception departure based on structural impracticability, you really don't get like advanced clearance under the ADA. It would really be left to a complaint or lawsuit filed, and then through, say, that would it be looked at and determine whether or not, in fact, structural impracticability was a factor.
Yeah, I personally would.
You could contact us or Department of Justice for informal guidance on whether a certain issue or constraint that for departure is, in our opinion, informal opinion, considered to rise to the level of structurally impractical.
I really think
Great.
it is something like you're seeing on screen. It really is something that, assume it's something that severe.
Okay, let's talk about entrances. Deb?
Sure. So under the AAB regs, all entrances to units in the building must be accessible. And one thing that the board has seen in the past is a facade trying to look like front stoops, entrances with front stoops. If those are actually entrances to units, they all have to comply, even if there's a common corridor in the building that provides actually the main entrance to the unit. If these are used as entrances, they must comply with the requirements.
Great. And we're not going to go over UFAS or ADA or FHA, since we're in Massachusetts and MAB sort of covers it and tells us that all entrances have to be accessible. So accessible routes. We're looking for accessible routes from site arrival points. Be it the sidewalk, the passenger drop-off area, the accessible parking, or if there's transportation on the site itself. Deb?
So accessible routes to common and public use areas. So there's a lot of housing being developed where there are lots of activities going on the site. Some developments will have mail buildings, community centers, recreational activities, dog parks. All of the routes that lead to those facilities must be accessible. So anytime you construct a route on a site, it has to be accessible unless you get a variance from the AAB. Some of the things that I've seen out in the field and you need to watch out for is, access to all of these kind of common spaces like mailboxes, being able to get up onto the sidewalk, access a mailbox if it's outside. Next slide. There are recreational areas such as picnic tables, places where people can go and hang out. Make sure you provide accessible routes so that all residents have access to those things. Trash areas, a lot of developments will have one common exterior trash area. Make sure you have accessible routes to all the trash areas, not just one.
And then I'm just going to bop in here to sort of remind everybody what the accessible route requirements are. And I know most of you are familiar with this, but stable, firm, and slip resistant. So it doesn't have to be paved. It just has to meet this standard of stable, firm, and slip resistant. 36-inch minimum width, cross slope 2% maximum, and excuse me, running slope 5% maximum. And the reason I emphasize this is because I see a lot of sites where the running slope is more than 5%. And if it's more than 5%, it needs to be treated as a ramp. And that means you're going to have handrails, you're going to have a level space at the top and bottom and every 30 feet. So it's going to be a lot more expensive. And it's a lot more difficult for people to traverse. If you've ever been in a wheelchair, or if you've ever pushed somebody in a wheelchair, or if you've ever rolled a heavy suitcase up a ramp, you know that it's fairly steep. So we really encourage people to get to that 5% or lower grade, but also because if it's any steeper than that, it needs to be, it's considered to be a ramp. So talk a little bit about common areas, Deb.
So in common areas, there are a lot of common areas lately that I've been finding, but they're all required to be accessible. Accessible parking, leasing and rental offices, common toilet rooms, community buildings, common kitchens. Those are kind of the general ones that people get. And the photo shows an accessible kitchen, which could be in a common room. Next slide. Also, accessibility is required to get into the pool area. I see a lot of pool gates that either the hardware isn't compliant or they fail to remember that you need the clearance on the pool side and you need to extend the walkway on both sides of the gate. Rinsing showers outside, you have to be able to get to them. Next slide. Laundry facilities, if they're a common laundry. Recreational areas, if you have paths that people are walking on. Swimming pools, the AAB does require access into the swimming pool. It is not as specific as what is required under FHA or ADA. So, there's a little difference in that, and maybe Rex or Dave can speak to that, but in the AAB, it just says a lift, but it doesn't tell you too much about what's required.
Dave, you want to pop in here?
Yes. So the ADA standards have very descriptive requirements for lift or sloped entry access into pools, and they would be applicable to any kind of common use area, including a swimming pool provided on a facility covered as housing. Now, when we do get the question about in terms of if it's a privately owned condominium or apartment building, the ADA's coverage of pools and other common use areas, which are again are very detailed, are only going to apply if the pool is more or less open to the general public as a public accommodation. If it's a common use area available only to residents and their guests, then it in the privately owned building, it may not be covered by the ADA.
And in regard to fair housing, the fair housing guidelines themselves are not nearly as comprehensive as the ADA. It's really, is the pool an accessible route? Can you get to the pool? It has no requirement for a lift. However, if you're using one of the safe harbors other than the guidelines themselves, particularly the later ones that are the IBC has a tendency to track the ADA requirements. So you may have a requirement if for a pool lift or one of the other type of entries in they're similar to the ADA. It's definitely at this point something I would go to the trouble to pay attention to and assess what's appropriate given the safe harbor you're using.
Great. Deb?
Yeah, things to watch out for that I see frequently. Community rooms with built-in high top tables. You need 5% of the dining or work surfaces to be accessible. Lots of community facilities now, community buildings and market rate housing are pretty elaborate, have bars and seating and all kinds of stuff. So just be cautious of that. A lot of them have gyms and exercise rooms. Make sure you have an accessible route to get through the room. Individual workrooms in the community building all need to comply. If you have, I've seen places where there are small either cabanas or small little meeting rooms or individual rooms where people can go work, due to COVID, people might not want to work in their home, but can go into this little workroom. They all need to comply with doorway width, clearance, hardware, and maneuvering clearance. Turning space isn't required, but you have to be able to get in the room. As I said, individual cabanas on a pool deck I have seen, they all need to comply with the requirements. Exterior bars, gas grills, all kinds of amenity spaces in multi-unit developments that I see that people get hung up on. So just make sure for, gas grills, all the controls and operating mechanisms are within reach range, and that all amenity spaces be accessible. I've seen bocce courts and things like that. So one of the other big ones that I see are dog washing areas. Make sure that the controls to operate the actual dog wash are within reach range. When you have it, a lot of that is dependent on the equipment that's provided, but you want to make sure that you can access the controls for those things. Mailboxes are another thing. It's sometimes there's a little bit of confusion between the U.S. Postal Service and what the accessibility requirements are, but AAB still allows a 54-inch high side reach. So all mailboxes would be required to be no higher than 54 inches to the highest operable part. ADA goes down to 48, but I mean, Dave can speak to that, only serving the accessible units, I believe.
That's correct, Debbie.
Yeah.
So the 5% units, mailboxes for the 5% required to be mobility accessible would have to be within accessible reach range of maximum 48 inches.
So that's a little different than the AAB. I think vessel sinks, I don't know if people are still using them, but there was a period of time where there are a lot of vessel sinks I was seeing, just to make sure that the measurement is to the top of the sink, not to the rim or the counter. So generally the sink is going to be higher. And so when you use a vessel sink, you're limiting your clear knee space underneath because you have to account for the sink. and then the countertop. So just be cautious of that. Obviously, the pipes underneath are not insulated, but the issue was really the vessel sink.
Okay, just talk a little bit about vertical access in the building, because this is probably one of the most frequent questions we get, which is an elevator required in my multifamily housing, new construction? And just to clarify that an elevator is not required as long as the residential dwelling units with mobility features, the common use areas that serve those residential dwelling units with mobility features, and the public use areas serving the residential dwelling units are all on an accessible route. So if you have a building, a two-story building, let's say, you're not planning to put in an elevator, and you have all of the accessible units on the first floor, that's fine. And you're not required to have an elevator in the building. You just need to make sure that somebody can get to all the common use areas that serve it, the public use areas that serve it. So generally an elevator is not required, but Rex, do you want to pop in on this one?
Yeah, so as we discussed last time, all ground floor units are covered. Sometimes, you know, from an outward appearance, a building doesn't seem to have a ground floor unit, ground floor dwelling units, but in fact, that'll be your first story of ground floor. Your first story of units will be your ground floor. For instance, here we have shops and so forth underneath, and those single story units above do have to comply with fair housing. So let's go to the next slide. I think that'll. Now, you're not required to necessarily have more than one ground floor. So if you had a similar instance to what I showed before, but you also had units that were at the grade, perhaps the building was split like we have here between, say, so where I had common use a garage under one situation and then the rest was on the grade, I wouldn't have to have an additional ground floor unit above the garage as far as the fair housing guidelines go. Did you have any comments on this, Deborah?
No, the AAB would be the same.
Okay, I just want to make sure. So I think that pretty much covers it. Did you have any other questions, Kathy?
No, that's great. So we're going to get right into the dwelling units. We've covered sort of getting to the dwelling units, and now we will talk about the dwelling units. Rex?
So the fair housing guidelines require for the units that are covered that you have an accessible route that goes through into and through the unit and takes you to all the primary area, or all the areas that are going to be used. There are a few notes I would make about this. For instance, once you get inside the unit, you don't have to provide maneuvering clearances at the doors. If a unit has a loft, you're not required to have, it's still considered a single story unit, but if it has a loft and there's certain stipulations on that, you wouldn't have to access the route to the loft or to an unfinished basement. So there is a requirement for an accessible route. The route itself is very much like you would find in something like the ADA, but the extent of it will probably be less.
Great, and I think this is a good time to clarify for all of the laws that we're talking about, what the requirements are for internal doors, for interior doors in the unit. So Deb, anything group one or group two?
Yes, so under the AAB, all doors within a group one unit, as well as group two, need to comply or be capable of complying with the requirements. So the maneuvering clearance on doors, for example, you can have a door swing in and not have the 18 inches of clearance on the pull side if it can be adapted in the future to provide that clearance. So the way the language works is it's either it complies or is capable of complying. There are no exceptions for sunken living rooms or dining rooms or lofts. They all have to be on an accessible route.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Debbie, because you do have some provisions for sunken areas, like in living rooms. They are permissible to an extent.
Okay, so Dave, any clarification on ADA requirements for interior doors?
Yes, and that would be that we would require the maneuvering clearance on both sides of the door for doors used for full user passage. And we don't have that adaptation exception allowance that Debbie mentioned. So they would have to be compliant from in design to have to provide the requisite maneuvering clearance, including strike site clearance, both on both sides.
And Rex 504, HUD's 504 regs?
It's going to pretty much track what the ADA does. It's not going to be very different from that. You will have to have, and the big thing is the maneuvering clearance at the doors.
Yeah. So big difference if you're getting federal funding from HUD, or if it's an ADA compliance issue, it's a state or local government housing, or the housing that's connected to a place of education. Very important to know, because the requirement's going to be very different.
And I think this is a good place just to reiterate the point that remember, fair housing is covering a lot more units than are covered under the ADA or Section 504. So the intent is not the same level of accessibility, because you may be covering every unit that's built on the ground floor as opposed to the 5%. So you can see in this discussion here, you know, there is definitely a difference in the intent of fair housing. It's broader but less accessible.
Great. And, you know, since we're on this plan, I'm just wondering if you could all speak very quickly to storage, closet issues, because we get a lot of questions about closets, and we've got two showing here. So Deb, do you want to pop in first on the closet obligations, storage closets? Yeah.
So under the AAB, any closet that exceeds 24 inches in depth, you have to have a 32-inch clear opening for at least one of the doors to get into the closet. Other than that, it's just clear floor space in front of the closet.
Okay, Rex.
The Fair Housing Act got design guidelines. They don't have much in the way of requirements for shelving or closet space. It just addresses doors that are used for user passage. So if you have like a walk-in closet, you'll have a requirement for the door to you know, be the 32 inches nominally clear. But if it's just like a reach-in closet, a typical coat closet, for instance, there is no requirement for that door necessarily. Of course, you want to follow good design practices. And I think the 24-inch rule is kind of a good determination of when you really need to go through a door or not. But again, that's not a requirement anywhere in the fair housing. That's just this kind of rule of thumb.
And Dave?
Pretty much the ADA scenario is very similar to what Rex outlined.
Okay, and I know a lot of people want to use the, you know, the doors that sort of fold, where each panel is not necessarily providing 32 inches of clear opening. Can you just address that quickly? Dave, do you want to talk about that first? You know, where you've got the kind of doors where you open them. Yeah,
the bifold doors. I mean, for a storage closet, again, not like a walk-in. You're going to have to make sure that whatever door you have clears the usable clear floor space at the storage. So if, you know, for example, if you have a parallel approach, then you have to make sure that those doors, when they open, clear the required clear floor space. Or if it's a forward approach into the closet, then it's important that the doors totally get out of the way of the required clear floor space.
Deb, anything on bifold doors for?
No, pretty similar to what Dave just said.
Okay, and Rex?
And there's no prohibition on bifold doors. Certainly you could use them on a door that you're not passing through. I'd say if it was intended to be a passage door, like for some reason, you would, I know you can debate this, but I would pretty much take the route of like the ADA is, and I would judge that by one folding door, by one leaf, so that you could open one folding door and pass through. There's a debate if you would have to open both doors. Okay. Usually folding doors work in sets, you know, it's a bifolding situation.
Great. So Rex?
So now another thing about the accessible route requirement under fair housing is it does have some differences in what's a permissible change in heights from interior to exterior spaces that would probably exceed what would be permissible under the ADA. And that's because if you have a pervious, and this is at secondary entrance. The primary entrance is going to pretty much track what's in the ADA on the exterior side in terms of the threshold, and like your entry door into the unit. And that's pretty much going to track ADA. But if the secondary entrance is out to a balcony or a patio, they're going to be a little different. First off, if you have a pervious surface, like a wood deck, you can set that deck a 1/2 inch below the interior floor level. So that's a 1/2 inch for the floor level. So then you would additionally have the permissible height threshold. So you can see that's going to probably be something that would not be permissible under the ADA, because it's going to be too much of an overall height change for an accessible route. Now, the big difference is when you have an impervious surface, such as a concrete balcony, for instance, you're permitted to go 4 inches from the interior finished floor level down to the top of that exterior impervious surface. So that's a pretty big difference. The belief is that you could come back and modify that with like a raised deck. There's a little image down here on the bottom of the slide that shows where somebody's done an insert that would raise up that level. So the idea is that there would be a later tenant modification that would be possible to address this. So they did hold that distance down, the 4 inches, so it's manageable, but it is a very big step that would be completely unacceptable under something like the UFIS or the ADA. Do you have any comment on this, Deb?
Yeah, under AAB, there's no 4-inch maximum provision. It just basically talks about where it is necessary to have a change in elevation, due to water or snow and things like that. You should be capable of providing raised decking, which would be level with the, the floor inside. One thing to be cautious about is that if you do provide that raised decking, you should check the height of your handrails that surround the deck, because by building code, they may have to be a certain height. And once you add raised decking onto that, you may be below that. So something to look at.
Great. And Dave, for the ADA units?
Yes, this is an important difference because the ADA standards are more stringent in that they don't really provide any allowance for the transition from interior to an exterior space. You need to treat it as any other door threshold, which would permit a 1/2 inch maximum for the threshold or change in level. If that threshold is higher than a 1/4 inch, it has to be beveled, maximum 1 to 2 for the but the total change in elevation can't exceed 1/2 inch.
Okay, Deb?
Okay, so things to look out for with controls and outlets. Although this is actually an FHA requirement, not an AAB requirement, because AAB has not amended its regs to bring the reach range down to 48 inches. But so for switches, light switches and things like that, 48 inches maximum. To the highest operable part, I usually recommend that people put the electrical box at 48 inches to the top of the box, so they'll always ensure that 48 meets the top of the switch, because depending on the type of switch you install, the actual top of the switch could be higher than 48. So putting the box in at 48 to top of box will take care of that. And then the lower outlet's 15 inches. So it's making sure you check before the sheetrock goes up, so you don't have to undo it. It's easier to move the box during the phase on the left than it is on the right. Things to look out for are the outlets underneath windows. Because the electrical code requires outlets so many feet, you may end up with an outlet underneath the window, and technically you need to request a variance from the AAB if you cannot meet the 15-inch minimum to the center line of the lowest receptacle.
So Deb, I had a question.
Go ahead.
Are all controls covered under the Massachusetts code?
Yes.
All right, so in fair housing, so it is more stringent. In that respect, I want to point out, because it's more stringent in fair housing, you do have in the guidelines, you do have a little bit of a stipulation for what are called comparable controls. For instance, if you have 2 light switches that operate the same light, it's possible that you could just do one.
Right.
It really depends on the situation. You need to be careful with that, because it really is intended for redundant controls.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to get into the bathrooms and the kitchens for Group 1 and the Fair Housing Act units. So Rex?
So the this is requirement, I believe we're on requirement 7 of the design and construction, which really deals with the clear floor spaces in bathrooms and kitchens. Right now, we're going to talk about bathrooms. You have you'll see clear floor spaces for toilets are very similar looking to what you see in UFAS or ADA, but they are very different in that, for instance, things can overlap the clear floor space that would not be permissible under the ADA or UFAS. For instance, here we see that the bathroom vanity is overlapping the space for the toilet, so be careful about that. You're required to have a 30 by 48 inch space at the lavatory. This can be forward or side approach. Again, a big difference. You don't have to have a knee space. You can do forward approaches, and that may actually be for other design reasons desirable in some instances. If you do that, you are permitted to have an adaptable cabinet, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And there's also, I don't recall, Kathy, if we were talking about A and B specifications, but you do have 2 different specifications you can use for bathrooms that do change things a little bit. Primarily the maneuvering space at a bathtub is what it really affects. Under the one specification, the toilet could be next to the tub. Under the other specification, the specification B, you have to have the 30 by 48 clear at the control wall of the tub. So I think that pretty much, it's a very brief summary. You can get into the minutia of this, but basically every fixture is going to have a clear floor space. You have to have a maneuvering space outside the swing of the door, and you either do all of the bathrooms in the unit as under the type A specification, or you can do one bathroom in the unit under this type B specification, which is a little bit more accessible than the A. It has to have a bathing fixture in it, if there's bathing fixtures in the unit, and I hope there would be. And I think that pretty much covers it, Kathy. I think we'll go into a little bit more detail as we go along. Here again, I was talking an example, particularly in some of the situations where powder rooms have to comply, which is really not that often. It's really when you have a multi-story unit that's covered, like in an elevator building, and it's the only bathroom on that floor that's covered by the Act. But you would have a removable base cabinet as shown here instead of a parallel. And like I say, there's other instances for design reasons you might want to do it. Next slide, please. But this is a good illustration when I'm talking about the cabinet can be removable. And really the key thing is that the floor beneath the lavatory has to be finished up to the wall. That's really the thing that describes it as being adaptable, so to speak. You just can't take a typical vanity and just tear it out and claim you comply. Also, you have to be a little bit careful with the height of the lavatory, and the Type B specification does have a maximum height requirement, so that might affect your cabinetry design too. So with that, we'll go on to reinforcing. You don't have to provide grab bars up front in a fair housing covered dwelling unit. What you do have to do is provide reinforcement for later installation of grab bars. These areas are smaller than those required under UFAS or the ADA. And certainly the Massachusetts code, as Debbie will take us into now. Are you going to talk about that now, Debbie? Or
yeah, Deb's going to talk about the
so I think it's a good segue here, and because this will probably supplant anything fair housing is going to require.
So for the reinforcement for grab bars around the toilet is pretty similar to FHA, but the reinforcement of the walls behind a tub and a shower is different. And for the shower or the tub, it is required to be on all 3 walls, and for the tub 60 inches above the finished floor. That photo happens to be of a group 2 tub because the controls are on the long wall, but definitely more blocking is required on the surrounds of tubs and showers. Be careful with prefab showers. Make sure the reinforcing is attached to the actual prefab unit. You cannot have that gap between the wall, between the unit and the wall. The actual reinforcement has to come from the factory or be installed on the unit itself. Not where grab bars might be, but where the AAB requires the reinforcement. One of the big differences. Yep, one of the big differences between FHA and AAB is in the shower section for a group 1 shower. The 30 by 48 inch minimum clear floor space under the AAB must be centered on the shower, and under FHA, the 30 by 48 minimum clear floor space must be parallel with the control wall. So if your shower is less than 48 inches wide, there will be a conflict and you will have to have some offset on either side. So next slide, I think, shows. So if you have a 48-inch wide shower, then you will comply, because as long as you don't have a sink or toilet in the clear floor space, the 30 by 48 is, in this instance, parallel with the control wall and also centered on the shower. It's when you get into maybe a 3 by 3 shower that it creates a problem.
Rex?
Yeah, so another thing you want to be careful about is the what we call the nailing flange issue. A lot of times the prefab showers are molded so that the flange sticks out perpendicular to the face of the unit, to the entry of the units. The idea being that, you know, you're going to slide the shower in place or bathtub in place, and you're going to nail it to the stud, and then you'll cover the stud, which makes sense, you know, from a construction point of view. But what it does is that it essentially pushes the clear floor space away from the fixture at the ground floor level. So you really want to be careful when you pick showers and tubs that nailing flange issue is either turned back at 90 degrees, so it's a non-issue, or that it's minimized. It's kind of hard to completely make the face of some of the fixtures flush with any adjacent wall. It's kind of not really conducive to some construction issues, but you do want to minimize it as much as possible. So you want to be careful, for instance, if you let your bathtub define the overall size of one portion of the wall, you'll be careful about that, because it may wind up being less than 5 feet and you'll have problems. And you don't want any of the trim work or anything around the flange to push the clear floor space so far away from the tub it becomes ineffective. Same thing for shower. Under the ADA, and I point out, under the ADA and UFAS, this becomes a really big issue, because for a transfer shower, you know, your clear floor space is supposed to really be almost flush with the threshold. So you want to be careful. You know, there's a much tighter requirement on that, and you might want to speak to that for a minute, Dave. But another thing I would point out, when the shower is the only fixture in a fair housing covered unit, then it must be a nominal of 3 by 3. A lot of the illustrations in the design manual show a 3 by 3 shower. I think that's a good idea, but it's not necessarily a requirement. It's only a requirement when it's the only shower in the unit. So, I mean, the only bathing fixture. You could have a tub, and then this wouldn't apply. It's the only bathing fixture in the unit, so keep that in mind.
Deb?
So things to look out for is the center line of the toilet from the wall. You want to be 18 inches spot on one side, and on the other side, it's a 15-inch minimum. So what I've seen in the past is that the 18 and 15 is basically 33. And if you have a plumber that's not too familiar with the FHA or AAB requirements, they may center the toilet in that 33-inch dimension. So you need to be careful. It's 18 on one side and 15 minimum on the other. So 33 is what you have to have if you have a sink next to the toilet. You need to have 33 inches from the sidewall to the counter, the edge of the counter of the sink or vanity.
Rex?
So the Fair Housing Guidelines has a requirement for a 40-inch clear space in kitchens, and this is taken from the face of appliances to the opposing countertop edge. So you want to be careful when you're laying out a kitchen that you account for this minimum clearance, because sometimes kitchens are kind of laid out generally and then they'll be finished out at a later point with, you know, perhaps the selection of appliances will change or nature of the counter. There'll be different options for different types of countertops and different units. So you want to be careful that you account for this 40-inch minimum clearance. And it's one of the big deals in the fair housing in regard to kitchen design, because it has a very similar requirement for the 30 by 48 clear floor space of the appliances, but it's also relying on this overall clearance between opposing counters and fixtures and cabinets to provide the, you know, the adequate maneuvering space in the kitchen, particularly if you have, say, both a standing person and a person using a wheelchair trying to use the space together. So there is a.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. No, sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
I'll let Deb take this one.
Oh, okay. So under FHA for recs, as well as under the AAB, if you have a U-shaped kitchen and you have a range or a sink or a cooktop at the base of the U, you need to have a 60-inch turning circle in the kitchen. The only time you can reduce that, and I don't think I've ever seen it, is if you have clear open knee space underneath the range or the sink at the end of the U. So this is in a group 1 kitchen, not a fully accessible group 2 kitchen. U-shaped kitchens have to have a 60-inch turning space.
Okay, I guess I'm going to talk just a little bit about L-shaped kitchen for the group 1 and FHA. The overall dimension has to be 48 inches minimum by 48 inches minimum, which I don't think is going to be too much of a problem. I think it would be awfully small if it was smaller. I do want to mention that under group 1, that the refrigerator doors have to be able to swing open 180 degrees, or a 30-inch minimum wide counter has to be provided next to the refrigerator. So that's an important thing to remember. And the L-shaped kitchen, there's a recommendation. You'll see it if you use the design manual. The Fair Housing Act design manual talks about the outlet being 36 inches from the corner so that it's easy to reach. That's a recommendation. It's not a requirement. Some of the ADA things, some of the AAB things have to do with the sink bowl depth being 6.5 inches minimum. All base cabinets are permitted, but they all must be capable of being removed to provide clear knee and toe spaces. We showed casters here, but they're not required. And then the walls need to be capable of supporting cabinets, so the inside bottom surface can be located between 42 and 54 inches high.
So Kathy, I have one very technical comment on that. And
Yeah.
I probably should have been clear the other day when I was talking with you. The guidelines themselves have no requirement for the 36-inch from the corner. That's true. It really was a recommendation it really was essentially a recommendation in the Fair Housing Act design manual. If you're using the design manual as a safe harbor instead of the guidelines, which you can do, I probably would do the 36 just because it's in there and that's what it says. But technically the guidelines does not specifically require this.
Great, thanks. And you can go on to this one, Rex.
Okay, so in fair housing kitchens, you're required to have a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space at the fixtures. I mean, the appliances, sorry, that's bathroom. Appliances, there are a couple of instances where they have to be parallel, and that is for a range, or a sink that doesn't have a knee space. Well, essentially, if it had knee space, it'd be centered too. And you will note that the clear floor spaces have to be centered. This is unlike some of the unlike the ADA or the UFAS standards. You know, the ADA only very periodically requires center lines for clear floor spaces. Usually it doesn't. But the fair housing, that's a big deal. Those clear floor spaces have to be centered. So was there anything else with that? Oh, yes. So let's talk some more about those appliances, because again, this kind of gets back to the 40-inch minimum requirement and the location of clear floor spaces at these fixtures, and particularly when you have like a range next to a sink and you have a potential conflict between parallel approaches. Deep deeper appliances are becoming more common. This has somewhat to do with the fact they're energy efficient and they have more insulation in them, so they wind up being bigger appliances than in the past, which I think is great that they're sustainable and all, but they do have an impact on the kitchen layout, so you want to keep that in mind. That this could, you might want to give an extra additional accounting for the space in the kitchen to account for these appliances. And I guess you had some comment here too, Debbie.
Well, I just have a comment about when you're measuring the clearance. It does not include handles. It's from the face of the appliance. It doesn't include the door handle or anything. So just.
Yeah, and fair housing is consistent with that too.
Okay, so moving on to the larger units, the group 2 ADA UFAS units, we'll go through the bathrooms and the kitchens.
So I guess this is me. So for
yeah,
the group 2 units, there is an additional requirement for clear floor space at fixtures. So these are anybody who's done work in Massachusetts over the years, these are the old 5% fully accessible units, but you don't have to install the grab bars at initial construction. A lot of this stuff is capable of being provided, but the space needs to be there. You need to have a forward approach to the sink. So you need to have clear floor space under the sink. Turning space has to be provided in the bathroom. This shows a roll-in shower. You do need wall reinforcement for the later installation of a seat if that person would like that. Under UFAS, the door may not swing into the clear floor space at fixtures, which I think is similar under the AAB. Although the AAB does have the adaptability requirement allowance of doors to swing in if they can be later modified to swing out if it need be. Under AAB, if you have 2 or more bathrooms in a group 2 unit, they both must comply, but one of them must have a roll-in shower. So if you have 2 bathrooms, you can have a tub in one, but the other one has to have a roll-in shower.
And same requirements, just wanted to pop that in again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Same requirements for reinforcement for the later installation of grab bars. I just want to make one call. What I see sometimes is that some of the walls that come to the site have the reinforcement in, and then the plumber comes, takes the reinforcement out. Who's ever on the job, you want to make sure that it goes back in. Sometimes it, sits on the floor and somebody may forget to put it back in, and then sheetrock, and then you don't have the reinforcement. So someone really needs to be on top of making sure all the reinforcement goes back in.
A little bit about these larger kitchens with the U-shaped example. So things that are a little bit confusing is that ADA and UFAS both require counter space, 30-inch minimum counter space with knee and toe clearance, or capable of providing knee and toe clearance. And AAB requires these 15-inch minimum counters that are next to the refrigerator and the cooktop and the sink, and those can overlap. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail here. We talked about the refrigerator. It has to be operable, capable of being open to 180 degrees. So unlike group 1, there's no specification that if you've got the 30-inch counter next to it, the 180 degrees goes away. It doesn't. It has to be able to be open to 180 degrees. And then other things that are required, again, the walls capable of supporting cabinets, so the inside surface can be located between 42 and 54. Outlets and controls that are over counters, 46 inches max. Dave's going to talk a little bit about the shelf space because that's a big issue. Sink capable of being relocated structurally. Spray hose we'll talk about in a minute. And then just to point out that under group 2, at least one base cabinet has to provide a drawer or drawers. So that's important. But we'll go through those some of those things now, Deb.
Yeah, things to look out for when you're looking at a group 2 kitchen. The dead giveaway is the wall oven in a group 2 kitchen, because you don't see those in a group 1 kitchen. The wall oven, the bottom of the floor of the oven is an exact dimension of 30 inches. And then the controls need to be a maximum of 54. Also, you need to have a retractable breadboard adjacent. If you have a side hinged, it has to be in the counter. It has to be underneath. And if it's a bottom hinge, it has to be in the counter adjacent to. In the sink, there should be a knockout for later installation of a hose, unless you have a single lever faucet that includes the hose in it. The cooktop has to have be capable of having knee space underneath it. So base cabinets are allowed, but you need to make sure that they are removable to provide knee space. Now, the AAB doesn't necessarily define what removable means, similar to FHA. It just, in some instances, it says replaceable, some instances it says removable. But the idea is make sure you finish the flooring underneath and make it as easy as possible to remove the base cabinet. One other hint is that generally 30-inch base cabinets do not make for 30-inch wide clear floor space or knee space, because you're not taking into account the size of the cabinet. If you have an exhaust hood over the stove or a disposal switch, they should be at the front face of the counter.
Rex?
So in terms of UFAS, this is the standard for Section 504, HUD's requirements for the Rehabilitation Act. It does have a requirement for a pull-out shelf at the oven, which is that's still in there. So you want to pay attention to that. And I would like to say something, really, this applies to ADA too, that counter depth's a big issue in these kitchens. As a matter of fact, it has a bigger impact on the design you might would think from the beginning. And this is because the cabinets are usually sized at 24 inches deep, and when you put a counter on it, it's going to be somewhere between 25 and 26 inches. The depth of the counter. Well, the reach range under the UFAS standard, which is very similar to the ADA, is you can't reach any more than 24 inches and it'd be considered to be an accessible reach. So you're going to have to think of how to deal with the controls, because the electrical code is going to make you put electrical outlets every so many feet over the counter. So what you're going to do is you're probably going to have to mount those you're probably going to have to surface mount those receptacles so they will be 24 inches or less to reach. They will probably overhang the counter a little bit. You could detail those and put them into the backsplash. That would probably look better, but that depends on how much your particular situation, what you feel like is appropriate. You theoretically could mount them in the face of the cabinets, so there's some reasons why people don't like that for safety, and for other reasons they don't like to do that. So like the potential for children to play with them and stuff, and also because of spills and so forth. So just bear that in mind. That's an important issue to keep in mind, that you can do a counter depth that's deeper than 24 inches, but you can't have outlets that are more than 24 inches to reach. So you'll have to resolve that conflict.
Dave, you want to pop in on this?
Yes, so the requirements for kitchens in the ADA standards, including those located in dwelling units, include a requirement that at least 50% of the shelf space provided in the kitchen be within accessible reach range. This is one provision that has been especially challenging to meet. We get a lot of questions on it. For example, in terms of what is possible, because what's the goal here is really to try and ensure enough adequate storage space below counters and within accessible reach range. Really the best way and the most reliable way to do this, in light of the likelihood of above counter storage cabinetry, is to really provide a pantry style type of storage that really provides adequate storage space within accessible reach range. Now, in terms of how this is interpreted, it's not really clear in the standards themselves, but we do advise that, when we're looking at the shelf space, it's a linear measure of shelf storage. We also recognize that, there can be some challenges in meeting it. So we typically allow other types of storage within accessible reach range to count as part of the 50%. So drawer storage, for example, which is likely going to be within the same area of accessible reach range below counters, it can count towards meeting this 50%.
Great. Just a reiteration sort of what I said before, talking about under ADA and UFAS is a work surface requirement. It's got to be at least 30 inches wide with knee and toe clearance. Again, the removable cabinet is permitted as long as the floor and the wall are finished. And then MAB Group 2, the 15-inch minimum counter space next to the sink, cooktop, and refrigerator. And all of these things can overlap. It's not like you need, three 15-inch spaces and one 30-inch space. As long as you've got what's specified, you don't need to have 4 different spaces. They can overlap.
Can I make a comment about the kitchen? I just wanted to remind people, and I apologize if you mentioned this earlier, for the ADA and UFAS, what constitutes a U-shaped kitchen is an important thing. And both of the kitchens you see here on the slide would be U-shaped kitchens under ADA, and I would take that as guidance for the UFAS, even though UFAS doesn't technically say. I'd pretty much look at it this way in regard to that.
Great. So Dave, we're moving on to the communication accessible units.
Yeah, so under the ADA standards require 5% of residential units to be mobility accessible. And in addition to that, they require at least 2% of the units to have accessible communication features. And these features would include, if you have a public use system to gain entry and communicate with a residential unit, that system has to be designed to be capable of supporting TTYs or telecommunication devices that are used to provide access for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Also, next slide, we make sure that for the dwelling, within the dwelling unit of these 2% of the units, the interface for use by residents has a telephone jack that's also capable of supporting voice and TTY communication with the public system interface. Next slide. Now, here's on this slide, we see an image of what is a TTY. This is an older technology that is really being supplanted by texting and cell phone use, but it is still a specification covered in the standards, and it's being replaced pretty much by newer technologies. We also require that in the 2% of units that there be a means to visually identify visitors without opening the door to a unit, so through a door scope, peephole, and that this provide a full range of view 180 degrees outside the unit. Next slide. Also, we require a hardwired electric doorbell to serve these units with a button or switch on the outside. And the activation button or switch would then in turn activate both an audible tone and a visible signal within the unit. And if they're located within bedrooms, then there must be control to deactivate this symbol or signal in bedrooms. Also, we have requirements for building fire alarm system wiring to extend within units if a building has a building-wide system. It must be wired to in the vicinity of the smoke detection system within units. Also, the alarm appliances must be permanently installed with both audible and visible signals. And we also require visible alarm appliances for the smoke detection within the units. We also specify too that while one alarm can be used for both the building-wide alarm system and the smoke detection system within units, that signal cannot be used for any other type of notification other than the alarms.
Great. Wow. Okay. So we have time for questions. We've got about 6 minutes. I'm sorry everybody was so tight. And I just want to mention that all the, both presentations and the sign up for the AIA and also the resources are going to be put in chat. And Jason, if you can do that now, and also maybe read us the first question. Jason Angel is one of our wonderful technical assistance specialists. I'm sure some of you have talked to him, and he's going to be helping with the questions. Jason?
Good morning. Yes. First question is for Rex. Can you describe the accessible route aspect of the fair housing law in more detail? They ask because there's a lot of work going on at the MPO and municipal level on streetscape design and use allocation.
So that sounds like that's in the, it'd be a common use area in terms of it's outside the unit. So your accessible route requirements are going to be very similar to what you'd have under the ADA. The Fair Housing Act guidelines references the 1986 ANSI standard, which is pretty much, I think, an accessible route, still pretty much the same set of requirements. However, it sounds like there may be some overlap with the public right of way. It sounds like this is a streetscape, so I assume there's probably this is being doing in joint work with the city or county. So I would make sure that you look at what the requirements are for public rights of way in Massachusetts, and also take a look at what the Access Board has generated in regard to proposed guidelines for public rights of way, because you'll want to look at that. Some of the issues in the street are going to be beyond what the standard for the fair housing specifies. You know, at the time it wasn't, you know, it didn't really address street grades and that kind of thing, or pedestrian crossings and so forth.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rick. Next, Jason.
Yeah, so regarding the accessible route into and through a unit, can you confirm MAAB only requires 3-foot clearance on one side of the bed only? The diagram in the slide shows clearance on both sides.
So if you're asking about group 1 units, you shall provide or be capable of providing wheelchair turning space clear of the door swing on one side of the bed in the primary bedroom. And where there is more than one bedroom, an additional bedroom shall also provide or capable of being provided turning space on based on a twin size bed.
Next question. Jason?
Sorry, so there's 2 questions here for 521 CMR kitchens. Do all upper kitchen cabinets in a group 2B unit have to be within reach range? And the second part is thinking about cabinets above a wall or oven or fridge. And then do all the kitchen base cabinets in group 2B units need to be omitted? Where a retractable breadboard required adjacent to a wall oven, can that have hosted in a fixed base cabinet?
Okay. Group 2B units were not the subject of this because that does not apply to multifamily housing. Group 2B applies to transient lodging. So that's a little different. But in Group 2B units, the wall cabinet shall be mounted so that the inside bottom surface of the cabinet is no higher than 48 inches above the floor. That's what the requirement states. And I'm not sure I got the second half of that question.
Yeah, well, we're Jason, next question. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Your diagram of a bathroom reinforced walls for later grab bar install and seem only to allow for 2 different heights, unlike the reinforced walls and showers. It's a concern as a wheelchair user because they want to install grab bars either lower or higher on the wall than what is shown. Is that allowed?
Certainly it's allowed. You may not have reinforcement, however. I mean, currently the only requirement is to have reinforcement between 32 and 38 inches above the floor. So if you feel that it should be greater than that, you certainly can write to the AAB and ask them to amend their regs to include some other requirement, but that's what the requirement is, 32 to 38.
Okay, next question.
Does the 15-inch minimum counter width adjacent to a cooktop also apply to built-in grills? In general, what regulation for group 1 carryover to an outdoor kitchen?
So an outdoor kitchen under the AAB would be subject to section 32, not group 1. And in section 32, there is a requirement for non-commercial kitchens in public facilities such as classrooms, community rooms, etc. And there is a requirement for the 15, where a sink and a cooking unit are within 15 inches of each other. You shall have, where a sink and cooking unit are within 15 inches of each other, access under the counter shall be continuous at a height of 27 inches to the underside of the counter.
Great. Time for one more question.
So this one was in kitchens where you showed the 40-inch clear width between the appliance and the further countertop. Does that need to be measured from the appliance handles?
I'll take it. No, it should be measured from the face of the appliance.
Fair housing's the same.
Great. Everybody, thank you so much. I'm so sorry that we're at 11:30. I wish we had another half hour for questions. Here are some resources. Jason has put in chat the links. I will keep the webinar open so you can copy those links, and please feel free to contact all of the resources with your questions. And maybe next time we'll do a webinar that is only questions, because obviously we have a lot and the material is very complicated. So thanks everybody for your time and attention.
Thank you all. Wonderful. Are the recording of the sessions available?
Yes, so I'll pop back in here. We will make the actual presentation itself accessible. I mean available. The BSA Access Committee will have that information on their website.
Great. With the two parts, because I looked for it and didn't find the part.
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great.
So the presentations, the videos, everything. If you
Excellent.
can't find it, shoot me an email.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Okay.
Ruth, are you talking about the video or the slides?
The slides I already have, the video.
Okay, the video. So that's
Yeah.
going to be on the access page. It's not up yet. I think
Okay.
it was just emailed to Susan to post a couple days ago. So usually
Perfect.
that takes about a week to get up.
Excellent. This is
Okay.
really lots and lots of information to absorb and digest and pay attention to. So thank you so much.
Yes. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.